made a recent short form video around a topic that a lot of people got very upset with, and it's in regards to staples. How a lot of commander players tend to build their decks around said staples and just auto include them based on their percentage include in the EDH rec page of their commander of choice. And I think that's ultimately a decision or a type of deck building that's holding a lot of creativity back. It's preventing you from unleashing the true potential of your commander, and it's one thing that honestly I do fall prey to, but also one I've been trying to prevent over the last year or so as I look to build different decks and showcase different commanders that I want to build on this channel. And so I wanted to showcase why that's a problem, why you shouldn't be playing Farewell in all your white decks or whatever other staple you want to include. Today we're going to be kind of focusing in on Farewell a little bit, but I promise to provide some other examples, and I wanted to really hone in this discussion from my perspective as also a constructed player. So follow along in this journey, and I promise I'll get to the commander player point here. But initially, I want to start off with a very core principle to constructed strategies that I think does apply in this case, in some extrapolation, to commander and 99 card singleton. The idea is that you have sideboards and main boards in constructed, but you don't in commander. So with that, your main board of your constructed deck has to be built in such a way where it really has a primary plan and is meant to do that plan with very minimal disruption. You might have some removals, some counter magic, whatever it might be. You can't let your opponent just go free reign, but in many ways your commander deck should be built the same way. In terms of constructed decks, a lot of times you do have that primary plan and are able to board into accentuating cards. You don't want to just pivot into something else. For example, Modern Mill, for many of you, you know the mill strategy, but in Modern Mill, you're usually playing blue and black Dimir, and you're looking to leverage the mill spells in blue and the removal and the interaction that black also provides to go about your game plan and get your opponent's deck to 0. Now, just because that may not work because my opponent is playing 15 copies of Endurance doesn't mean I pivot into like mono red burn out of my sideboard. I look to include cards like Ashiok Dreamrender or Soul Guide Lantern or Surgical Extraction or whatever it might be to then manipulate my opponent's graveyards. Maybe I mill over an Endurance, I surgical the Endurance, and now those copies don't exist in the deck. Maybe my opponent is also playing a graveyard strategy, so I have to be careful about how early I mill them. So I might implement something like a Soul Guide Lantern to play on turn 1, then I glimpse the unthinkable on turn 2, and then kind of exile their graveyard. And that way I'm still milling, but I'm doing so with an accentuation. I'm not going about a different plan. I didn't swap into attacks. I didn't go into the Goblin Charbelcher ultimate swap plan. But I think this is the type of mentality that a lot of players tend to get into with Commander, where they want to make sure that their deck has everything, that you have catch-alls. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that because the Commander format is one of a singleton format, but with data aggregation websites like EDH Rec, we see a lot of assimilation of the most powerful cards that you should automatically include because they are generically good. And a lot of times they do provide good options, Farewell being a good one because you can choose one or more. And so with that, you have the flexibility of being able to deal with anything at any time. The problem is, I think in a lot of ways, cards like that do hold you back because of a couple of reasons. And with the whole working towards being optimal in your strategy, I think people forget, like in these constructed strategies, to also just make sure you have a really concerned game plan, one that looks to implement maybe a combo or a certain synergy, and then you go about that game plan and protect that game plan instead of working to answer everyone else. Maybe look to protect the plan that you have on your end. And I think that's what a lot of people forget. And I want to try and highlight this with two main arguments. The first, we're going to look at Farewell, and the second, I actually want to kind of look at Lightning Greaves. And both of these are going to look to highlight staples in different ways. So firstly, I want to go over the idea of something like Farewell. And when it comes to something like this, I want to look at also the commander of Quintorius Field Historian, a card that cares about cards leaving your graveyard, but notably you don't get the additional benefit of cards leaving your graveyard in batches. It says one or more, then you get a spirit. So you don't want to be like mass exiling your graveyard or mass reanimating things. Try and go for one at a time. Now, Emergence from the Cocoon is a recent option that we got, which, you straight up just reanimate a card, take a card back from your graveyard into your battlefield. And so you can put cards in there with simple things like Faithless Looting. So those are cool options in there. You could also be playing things that provide easy sack fodder. So maybe cards that generate mana by sacking creatures. That's a good way to get cards in there, but that's a good like reanimation option. Now, if your opponent is exiling your graveyard or singular pieces of it, you could play something like Pull from Eternity, a card that grabs a card from exile that's also in white. Now, I believe there's a card in blue that grabs something on flashback and a card in green that grabs something from exile as well. I think it's just a creature card, but notably those aren't cards that you have access to. We have very limited options when it comes to something like this, but those are good options in this color. Now in red, you also have stuff like Squee, which you can cast repeatedly from exile over and over again, or in your graveyard. So if you have some type of sack engine, then maybe what you can do is you can use that to generate some mana, recast the Squee, get yourself a spirit token, sack those two, do it again. It may not be near infinite. I'm probably missing some pieces, but you get the idea. There are cards in each color that have reanimation effects, that have return effects, and that also allows you to hyper synergize with this card. It's a really popular Boros commander. It's not my personal style, but it's a really cool one. Now in this specific commander deck, my argument is that you shouldn't be playing Farewell. I don't think Farewell is the optimal thing to do. Just because it is the staple, it is a good option. I think there are some better ones. Namely, ask yourself, would you, just stop this video right now and ask yourself, comment down below, would you play Farewell in Quintorius Field Historian? I said you shouldn't, but would you? I think a lot of you would probably at this point say yes. It's a staple shaft. It has options. It has flexibility. I don't need to cast the exile all creatures. I could cast the exile all graveyards. Heck, even in the TikTok short form video, people have talked about how, yes, with Quintorius out, I'm just going to exile all graveyards, that way dealing with the graveyard player and creating one 3/2 spirit with Quintorius out. Sure, you can do that. There are options for you. You're the commander player. You are the ultimate captain in the ship that you're piloting through these crazy seas. But when it comes to this, I think there's a flaw here. And with this flaw, I think it comes from the fact that you are only creating one 3/2 spirit. And the reason I want to highlight that is, okay, you have cast Farewell. You have cast Farewell to deal with not only your graveyard to get 3/2, but you're probably doing it to deal with the other opposing graveyard player. You got the Emotech player that's going off with a bunch of artifacts. Heck, you like the flexibility of Farewell so much that Emotech player is probably playing like Darksteel Forge. All the artifacts are indestructible, and so you want to make sure that you're able to deal with that as well. So it has multiple options to it. Great, you have some flexibility. The question you have to ask yourself though is, yes, that player's going off. They're doing a bunch of things, doing a bunch of crazy synergies and everything. If you're playing like a combo oriented version or like a very big go wide, you're building a big board, is what they're doing really stopping you? Or are you trying to stop them? What is the point of you exiling their graveyard and then exiling their artifacts? And then all of a sudden your opponent next to you, the next player in that rotation, takes the opportunity to then just cast a Wrath of God to then destroy all creatures. The thing is, you have to remember the dynamics of 4 players in that pod. You don't serve yourself well from being the first player to be proactive. So you also have to be careful about when you're playing this, but leaving yourself open to then get got just because now that player doesn't have to worry about the Emotechs like graveyard synergies or their artifact synergies. They can just cast their Wrath of God. They can cast their, kind of their board wipe and get rid of the rest of your board. And now they've spent less mana. They've taken advantage of the free mana from you to then go about the rest of their game plan. Why does it have to be you that answers that? You can get your other players to also answer that, which is where I introduced the idea of flexibility in this as well. There are other options to Farewell. You could, in red, you could play different options for board wipes. You could play different options for reanimation spells. You could play protection spells in white that also just prevent your opponent from board wiping you. And so in those places where you play these subsequent spells that also add protection to your own board, maybe, you play something like Teferi's Protection to bring your board back. Obviously, there aren't many effects like Teferi's Protection. That's a very niche option, very extreme example. It's not like there's many copies of it. But then with that, you have these other options also in board wipes. You could play the Destroy effect. You have Austere Command, which provides you a little bit of flexibility. Austere Command can destroy very large creatures, destroy enchantments, artifacts, whatever it might be, and then you're able to swing in maybe for some lethal or some big damage. But then you might say, in response to that, yes, you are moving the ability to exile, which is very powerful. It's a very powerful effect. You might run into another staple in Heroic Intervention, which then makes everything hexproof and indestructible. That's great. I wanted to specifically bring this up because in that pod, why not rely on the other players to help you? I think the primary problem that a lot of players face with these staples is they feel like they need to answer everything. You have now cast a 6 mana board wipe that your opponent is now able to then further take advantage of that doesn't completely synergize with your stuff because you need cards entering the graveyard. Cards in graveyard need to leave for you to create spirits. You don't necessarily want to be exiling everything because you're going to be exiling your own things. So why bother being the person to answer everything, and you can force your opponents to do so? In addition to that, you can work with your opponents in stuff like austere command. If your opponent casts something like the heroic intervention to stop that from happening, then, well, have them work with them, speak with them, use your words to then ask them like, hey, can you cast a counter spell on that? Can you stop that? Can you bounce that back to their hand so they don't have the mana to cast it again? Work with them and say, hey, I'm not gonna exile all artifacts. I'm gonna choose to instead exile all enchantments and then leave the graveyards alone because I need that, and maybe that's helping them. Use the synergies that you have at the table. Your words, just like your life and your mana, are also a resource when it comes to a multiplayer pod. Heck, even when it comes to alternate options, one thing I'll say is that it's very easy to hate out the graveyard. It's very easy. You know, when people bring up the idea that austere command, not austere command, something like farewell also exiles graveyards, I think that's generally a weak argument. I think like farewell's biggest arguments are the fact that it gets rid of enchantments and artifacts and exiles them. I think that's the best modes. The idea that you can destroy all creatures, the idea that you can exile all graveyards or exile all creatures, is honestly its weakest form, because I feel like there's a lot of effects that also do that as well. Heck, when it comes to graveyard effects, why not play something like Soul Guide Lantern? Soul Guide Lantern can exile all effects of another player. I mean, be honest with me, you're a graveyard deck. Are you playing against a lot of times another deck that's also full of graveyards? Chances are there's only one other person. So play that Soul Guide Lantern, ping something out on the enters, especially against my example of an Emotech deck. A lot of times those decks are like combo oriented decks that want to cycle a bunch of artifacts through in and out of their deck to create their board. So why not just exile that one piece on the ETB? And then if you don't need to exile their whole graveyard, cycle it to just draw a card. Drawing a card has obviously gotten much better over the years in white, thanks to red. Actually, the fact that this is Boros, the red part of it helps you draw cards. But why not just have that extra draw card? And heck, here's a little bit of legacy tech that also really works well in Quintorius. There's a budget option, something like Jack-o'-lantern, that comes in that you can then pay one to exile a singular piece, because let's be honest, a lot of graveyard players tend to be combo players, so they have like high synergy cards that they, you know, want to flash back or get back out. So exile that one card, draw a card off of it, and then when Jack-o'-lantern's in your graveyard, you can remove it from your graveyard, get 1 mana and a 3/2 spirit. You can cycle a colorless mana into a colored mana and then also get a 3/2 spirit. Look, folks, I'm not just arguing about staples. I'm also giving y'all Quintorius players free deck building advice. Just saying. The Jack-o'-lantern spice, if you include Jack-o'-lantern in your Quintorius deck, I want you to credit me. I want you to credit me when you post your Moxfield deck list. That's all I'm saying. If you care about artifacts so much, play something like Consulate Crackdown. If you want to synergize with your spirits and you want to like convoke things out, you could play something like Everything Comes to Dust. And then heck, as I mentioned, Austere Command for its flexibility. There are so many different options out there of cards that do really well in accordance to your game plan, that work with your game plan, that also don't just leave you open for crazy amounts of mana, and also just ends up being this catch-all that you don't really end up using optimally the whole time. A lot of times you don't want to be exiling your whole graveyard or your whole board. If you're just going to end up using Farewell for its best modes anyway, the exiling artifacts and enchantments, why not just find something like Consulate Crackdown that exiles all artifacts of the artifact player, or exiles enchantments with something else? Like, why not just play those cards instead? That's what I'm ultimately working with, folks. You can work with your own opponents to enable cards that you have in terms of alternate options. You can play other options if you find yourself using only certain modes of something like the Farewell. And then you can just play other options that better synergize with your deck. Why bother board wiping if the board wipe or the graveyard hate or whatever really ruins your plan as well? Make it one-sided. Stop that one player, stop those two players, and find pieces that also synergize, like the Jack-o'-lantern, because sometimes all you need, especially if you're a combo-oriented player or you just need one more turn to go wide, all you need is that one card to stop instead of resetting everything. The whole problem I have with board wipes a lot of times, I have a big hate for Farewell for it, is sometimes people will cast board wipes in situations where it's not really like letting them win the game. And I find Farewell is the biggest like proponent of this. You're just like resetting the board for the sake of resetting. And sometimes boards do require resets, but sometimes you can actually remove the board in a way that allows you to win. This is why Cyclonic Rift is really powerful. It's the thing that no one really understands. Like, yeah, you're bouncing all your opponent's stuff, but why is that important? It's the fact that it's a reset that actually allows you to win the game, quote unquote. It clears the board. End step Cyclonic Rift protected with something like a Boseiju land, just making it uncounterable. Like, stuff like that is really powerful because it allows you to not only reset the board, but to your advantage. It's not like your reset. You still have all your pieces and you're then able to go in for some type of alpha swing. cards like that are really powerful. And there are options like that in white that can be one-sided, that you can turn one-sided even in red. So play those options because they end up just being a lot better in general. The second point that I really want to highlight here is around lightning greaves, and it's a small section, so I do want to go over this, and it's the idea that a lot of staples are misunderstood in their use. And so when it comes to these staples, why do you play lightning greaves? Right? I mean, it's pretty simple for a lot of people to answer. It gives your creatures haste and shroud at 0. I mean, you pay it for 2, but you know what I mean. You can bounce it between a lot of other creatures. So what you can do is you can give it to one creature for 0, they activate an ability, then you can bounce it to another creature, they activate an ability for 0 if you just played it. Like, it gives a bunch of haste to a bunch of creatures if you have a bunch of activated abilities, which is the best case scenario for it. But in general, it gives haste and shroud, a little bit of protection, allows your commander to go off immediately. Now, if you go to the EDH rec page for Lightning Greaves and look at the commanders that it is most played in, most amount of commanders submitted this way, you see it in Kaalia, which makes sense. You want Kaalia to have haste, attack immediately, and then you want Kaalia to use its abilities, so you want its protection so it stays around. Makes sense. You have an immediate attack trigger. You see it in Zuladok, which is important because it's a colorless commander that sometimes lacks the whole protection option, because at the end of the day, it's colorless. It's not white, it's not any other color. The minute you remove that, you lose a lot of your kind of better options. So you want Zuladok around because the static effect of what it has is really important. So just having this ability out for 0, or 2, I should say, and giving it protection is really important. And then finally, out of the top 3, the last one that's really important is something like the Krenko. Krenko comes down and immediately wants to activate its abilities. So not only are you protecting it, but you're also just getting an immediate ability, an immediate effect that, honestly, if you're playing Krenko, 9 times out of 10, when you cast Krenko, you need that thing activated immediately. So you're already playing other haste enablers to make sure this happens, but you need this redundancy piece because your commander has an activated ability that he needs to use immediately. You need as many haste options as possible to make sure you're creating 50,000 goblin tokens for your impact trimmers when. That just is what needs to happen. But if you go down the list, my first problem is in Ishin. Ishin is a 3-color, Ishin, whatever, is a commander that cares about attacks. It's like a Panharmonicon for attack triggers. Now, my problem is that I think the best ability on Lightning Greaves is not the protection. The Shroud is actually a lot worse because Hexproof makes it so your opponents can't target it. Shroud makes it so you can't target it. That's my problem. If you have other protection spells, other things that you want to put onto the Ishin, you can no longer do that. You have to ungive it protection, give it something, and then re-give it a protection, leaving a window of opportunity for your opponents to then answer it. And so with something like Ishin that also doesn't have an activated ability or doesn't immediately need to attack, I just feel like you're already playing stuff in red that has so many other extra combat turns, so many other haste enablers, think about Anger in Graveyard, so many other protection spells in white that many of them honestly do draw cards. And then even in black, if you're playing higher level, you could tutor for the cards you need. If you're playing maybe mid or lower power, you could just play the draw options. You have options in all these colors that help you get the cards you want. So why not just play more of those? Why not just play a haste enabler instead of the Greaves? Why not just play a protection spell instead of the Greaves? Why not just play a draw card instead of the Greaves to draw into other options? The Ishin player doesn't always need Ishin. You are playing creatures that inherently have attack triggers. If the attack trigger goes off once, honestly, it's probably good enough. It's probably good enough. You're doing a lot of things anyway. Doing it multiple times is win more. It's great. There are a lot of combos that combo with it. But if you just get a haste enabler out, play your creature, get its attack trigger, unless you built it bad, isn't the attack trigger once just good enough? Sure, there are ones that can be improved. A lot of times, if you just get a bunch out with the haste enabler, that's good enough. You don't need it in this deck. You don't need to protect the commander. Why use this slot? Play another creature, play another haste enabler, play another protection spell instead of something like this. If you're not using it to protect your commander, I don't see the need in it. So again, it's a card that does do what the deck wants to do, but is it optimal? Is it really the card that you really need in that situation? In those other commanders that I highlighted, yeah, there are uses for it in those decks, but is it really the card that you want in this deck? And that is what I really want to highlight in this video today. Regardless of how I use my title and thumbnail to clickbait into you, I can honestly say that in all these decks, you could play these cards. You could. At the end of the day, options are great. I'm a person that likes options, but also I've been trying to do better with my synergies. You can do better from, you know, just playing less staples and playing cards that synergize better with your commander decks. You don't need to dilute your deck full of card draw in your blue decks, full of tutors in your black decks. You can just play better options. Like, not every blue deck needs something like, this is a common one actually. So I'm very at fault with this. One of the first blue spells that I put in all my blue decks, honestly, it is all my blue decks that I think about: Brainstorm. And this is my problem. I think a lot of people get into this idea that Brainstorm is inherently powerful because it comes from Constructed. Yes, Brainstorm is really powerful when it comes into Constructed. The thing with Brainstorm is that a lot of people will argue that Brainstorm isn't good because you can't shuffle your deck. These are the things that you need to understand. Like, there are cards that have flexibility and there are cards that synergize better, but there are cards that inherently just do the best at what they do. You don't need shuffle effects to make Brainstorm good. You don't need that. Which is why I think, yes, I could replace Brainstorm, but a lot of card draw spells like this in blue are inherently good because of what they do. Because Brainstorm, just 1 mana draws you 3 cards. It will literally just draw you 3 cards. You get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck. Yes, you put 2 back. Even if you top deck Brainstorm with no cards in hand, you still get to use 1 mana to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and pick the best card out of that. You cannot do that with something like Opt, with something like, you know, a surveil card or something like that. Like, you can't do that with those cards, which is why Brainstorm is inherently good, because it is just inherently that powerful, because it's a low power card. It's a low power cantrip. It does that much. So I've seen an argument for many people saying, like, you don't need to include these cards. You could play Brainstorm. You could, you know, in mill decks, you could play something like Visions of Beyond, and sure, that you could play Visions and Brainstorm, but there are certain cards in certain decks that just need to be included because they are the best at that option. Farewell has other options to it. You have other exile effects. You have other destroy effects. You have other board wipes. Brainstorm has no analog. There is no analog to what Brainstorm does for its rate. Brainstorm is the only card that can draw 3 cards in this goddamn format. That's all I'm saying for 1 mana. Without having to jump through hoops, it will literally just draw you 3 cards. Yes, you put 2 back, but you get to see 3 cards. You get to see 3 cards at 1 mana. And this is where the distinction is I want to make between playing staples that have other options and playing staples that can't do anything better. Farewell, you can say that yes, there's nothing that does it at those options, but you have to analyze the modality of it. Brainstorm only does one thing. It draws 3 cards. Farewell does multiple things. And so you have to analyze, when you are playing in Commander, what are the options you're picking? Are you always picking the Graveyard Hate? Are you always picking the Artifact Exile effect based on your pod? Why play Farewell then? If you're playing Quintorius, why play Farewell? Just play Consulate Crackdown. Play something that gets rid of artifacts, that bounces artifacts. Or, I mean, you're in Boros, so maybe not that. But play something that deals with artifacts then if you're always picking the artifact mode. Play something that deals with enchantments if you're always picking the enchantment mode. Just play something that better plays to those modes. Or play something like Austere Command that has those benefits that you can then work with your opponent on kind of dealing with. Because at the end of the day, when you're destroying all lands, you're drawing the ire of the whole table. And so when you're of course dealing with that one person from winning, you're also pissing off this one player because they felt like they could stop the whole situation as well. But you pulled the trigger first by being proactive and then not having them kind of do something. And then you're like, oh, come on. I had the option to them. Now I lost my mana rock. And now I lost my ramp. Now I lost whatever. And now I'm set back so far. So you're pissing everybody off. And honestly, it's exile everything. Do you have some type of exile protection in your deck to stop you from doing that? All is to say, I'm blabbing at this point. I think there's a lot of reasons why people shouldn't be forcing staples into their deck. And there's a lot of better that we can do in terms of our deck building. Now, look, I may not have the pros that many of your other Commander content creators have. I'm just blabbing at a screen, but I hope y'all got the point here. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you agree with my idea of staples? Do you agree with my idea that maybe we should be playing less farewells and maybe more prints? Maybe more brainstorms, honestly, and maybe less dark rituals in our Aminatu decks. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. That's been my Commander yap for the week, I guess. Maybe more yapping in the future. Have a great weekend, y'all.